Hello and welcome to the first Armstrong Lloyd expert interview. Armstrong Lloyd is a marketing technology recruitment specialist. We support hiring managers and their HR teams identify and retain the best talent for their marketing teams and smash their goals. I'm joined by Matt Phelan today, the co-founder of the Happiness Index and the author of The Freedom to Be Happy. Matt, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Karen.
Armstrong Lloyd has recently produced a salary and diversity report. And I thought one of the key themes that really arose from that report was actually happiness, funny enough. So I thought, who better than to dive into the subject in more detail than Matt? So Matt, do you want to give us a bit of an introduction about yourself and why happiness is important to you?
Yeah, that's a really good question and a tough one, actually. I suppose I'll answer it personally and professionally. Personally, happiness for me is being able to balance being a good dad and a good CEO. And I would be very happy doing both 8 out of 10. But if one became 10 out of 10 and one became 6 out of 10, I would actually be unhappy. So I just share with you my own personal thoughts on happiness. From a company perspective, the Happiness Index is an employee engagement and happiness platform. What that means is companies use our platform to understand what's making their employees happy and unhappy. Understanding what makes employees unhappy is as important as understanding what makes employees happy, which often surprises people. So it's really the study of how people feel and why they feel the way they do, so that you can get all the lovely things that we're going to go on to talk about that increase if you have happier employees.
Brilliant stuff. Absolutely. So yeah, that's a good point. So what factors do affect happiness in the workplace then?
Okay, so there's thousands, Karen. But let's start with the top 4. So the top 4 drivers of happiness are psychological safety, freedom to take opportunities, acknowledgement, and the number 1 driver in every country is positive relationships. So the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th driver will change from country to country, but the one that doesn't change is positive relationships.
Excellent. And it's really interesting actually that you mentioned safety actually and feeling safe, because at the moment, the last year, we've been in a slightly uninteresting, to put it politely, economic climate where lots of things have happened outside of people's control, where they could potentially be feeling unsafe or their jobs could be feeling unsafe. And how do you think this particular area and the current economy would affect people's happiness in that context from your factor you mentioned?
And this is a really good question, because the thing to remember about employees, and we're all employees if we're in a job, is that we're all human beings. So stuff that happens at home impacts stuff that happens at work and vice versa. So anything that's happening big like that will impact employee happiness. We've just come out of the pandemic period where it was horrific. The data is horrible to look at, the ups and downs of what people were going through. Things like interest rates will impact your employees. And Karen, look, you and me or any employer in the world, we can't fix interest rates. We can't change them. We don't have that power. But having good, honest conversations with your employees about how it's impacting them is a starting point. But in terms of safety, although positive relationships is the number 1 driver of happiness, I always say, from my own personal point of view, safety is the first place to start. It's the fundamental, like making people feel safe is your first job as a manager, employer, leader, whatever label we want to put on it. Safety is absolutely key.
Yep. Okay. That's a really good point, actually. But sometimes safety and the feeling of unsafety and the burden of maybe a leadership team maybe makes them think, oh, do you know what? I don't actually care that people are happy. I just care that we're surviving and people feel safe and those are isolated. So if somebody had that view, what do you think that consequence might be to their business?
Well, I suppose from a neuroscientific perspective, if someone feels unsafe, they're going to go into fight, flight, or freeze. So the consequence of that if we just go through them, flight means someone actually might leave. So you may have a retention issue. If you think of it as someone hiding away, you might actually just lose a big part of someone's personality. Freeze, which doesn't get spoken about as much, is just someone who's at work, they're not contributing to meetings, they're just in freeze mode. So if we just talk about it from a brain perspective, it means people can't access things like their prefrontal cortex, is where things like creativity exist. So there are so many reasons why you don't want people to feel unsafe. And there's lots of misconceptions that you have to keep your team on their toes, and all these kind of things that are built up over time, which they're just not scientifically backed up. So yeah, there's about a million reasons, but I would think about fight, flight and freeze as the main three things for anyone listening to think in your head about why you wouldn't want an unhappy employee.
If you had got to the point where you sensed that people were feeling like this and unhappy, what could somebody practically do? Are there any ideas or guidance on what they could do?
So remember, happiness fluctuates from day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year. So what we're talking about happens to my employees. The best companies in the world, their employees will go through these flows, and that's totally normal. So the first thing you can do is listen, is sit down with people. So a platform like the Happiness Index does this at scale, but it shouldn't replace good management of sitting down with your employees and understanding what makes them unhappy. You won't be able to fix everything, but what you can do is work out what's important to them and hopefully improve in the areas where you can.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's the first thing is communication, really, isn't it? And understanding people and being human, because nobody's happy all of the time. And interesting enough, how often should we be happy? What's the average? What do you think we should consider? How often should we be feeling happy?
Yeah, so if we think about Winnie the Pooh, just for a second, we'll just go outside of work. If you think about Tigger as a character and you think about Eeyore, what the research says is about 50% of our happiness comes from our DNA, and about 40% comes from the way that we think. So it's likely that Tigger is quite an optimistic animal, and it's quite likely that Eeyore is the opposite of optimistic. To answer your question, it ranges from person to person. And it's one of the reasons I don't like benchmarks, because there's a really good saying, which is comparison is the thief of joy. And so what I think is really important is just to understand how you feel, understand how the people around you feel, and work out how you could slowly improve parts of the environment, what you're doing, what's happening in your life. So listening to yourself, listening to those around you is really important. So I wouldn't get too hung up on how happy you should be, even though it's a good question, Karen, because it's brought up a good conversation. But just think about yourself. Or you can only ever start where you are now, today. Start where you are now and start to think about things that are making you unhappy that you might be able to change in life.
I love that you said that the comparison is the thief of joy. I think that's a really brilliant phrase. I think I might use that in another context somewhere. But I think, do you know where that really comes into play? Going slightly left wing here is when you have children, isn't it? Because it's so easy to compare one child to another, evoking potentially sibling rivalry. And also in a workplace, you're not doing the same as him or her. So you can see where that person could then, you could have the superstar mentality versus the underperformers. And that's where you don't have that level playing field, I suppose. So it was really interesting.
Absolutely. I was listening to some comedians at the weekend, and they were talking about how there should be a room in the market for a low performance podcast, which I thought was quite funny and a good idea and a good concept. But I think the idea comes from the fact that there's this like misconception that we have to be high performance all the time, and that's just not healthy. A high performance as a team and an organization is something that makes sense, but for people to be on tenterhooks that they need to be performing every second of the day just doesn't make sense.
Interesting. And also there is the association or assumption that high performers are the happiest, when that also may not be the case. I mean, from your research, what level of person in a business is generally the happiest? Is there a correlation of a type of person? Or
so this is where you have to be really careful, because you're the average happiness of those around you. So and that's where some of the positive psychology books go a bit too far, because there's kind of like misconception that you can think yourself happy. But our definition of a high performance has to be from a team perspective, not from an individual perspective. Because if your version of high performance is to perform and push everyone else down, ultimately that's going to impact your own happiness because they're going to be unhappy. And eventually you could be experiencing things like burnout and so on from a lack of connection. We really need to look at what the definition of high performance is. And I would love to include in my definition things like psychological safety, things like being able to raise an idea in a meeting. That could be a new opportunity. So I would say the data shows happy employees perform better. But remember, that's from a group perspective, not just from an individual perspective.
No, that's brilliant. Yeah, I suppose when most of us think of performance, we think of things like the person that's getting the most revenue in for the company, or the person that's basically achieving to the bottom line. You know, we're thinking of those metrics and intangibles, which sometimes could potentially get lost, I suppose, when we're talking about performance, when they are not one of the 4 factors you mentioned at the beginning that affect.
Yeah, and think of a meeting, right? You might have someone who speaks, let's say the average meeting is 1 hour, and this person attends the same amount of meetings as the other person, and the other one person speaks in every meeting in the year for 20 minutes. You might think they're active, they're engaged, they're high performing. What you might find is that the person who speaks for 1 minute a meeting and actually comes up with a really good insight and ideas that actually transforms the business is actually the high performer. So it's really important to review what high performance is.
So let's talk about money. So it's funny, in the first 4 factors that you mentioned, there was no talk of like what I would call the hygiene factors, which is like the money or the environment so much in the company. But yet the study we've recently done, which obviously was focused on salary, but did touch on other aspects, 32% of the respondents who feel they were paid unfairly or unhappy, compared to 70% of those who considered themselves paidly were happy. So how do you think money can correlate to happiness in a workplace?
Yeah, it's a really good question again, Karen. So money does impact happiness. It absolutely does. But again, I think the important point, Karen, is to see it as a hygiene factor. Everyone wants to be paid fairly. And we've got all these things like gender inequality in pay and so on. So the first point is someone wants to be paid fairly. And that's the same as all factors. So in the West, there is a certain number that people need to get up to feel like they're paid fairly and for it not to impact happiness. But it's really important to also take ourselves out of a country like the UK, where more money might buy you a roof over your head, it might buy you food, it might clothe your children. So we have to remember, a bit like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if money is buying us those basic needs and we don't have them, it will make us happier. Absolutely. Where money doesn't make you happy is when it starts to get you a slightly better flat or a car with a better logo. And I'm using better in my definition, I mean expensive. Or it might get you a new t-shirt with, I've just got a white label, white t-shirt on. If I was to buy the same t-shirt with a more expensive logo on, it's very unlikely to make me happier. So happiness plays a part. My advice to all employees is you need to be looking at the market. You need to be paying as much as you can for your budget to pay people fairly, and then focus on the factors. But if you're paying half what someone can get somewhere else, it's natural that they're going to go and look. So see it as the hygiene factor to start with, but it can't come the be or end all.
Yeah, okay. And if people are working longer hours, our study, funny enough, showed that people that were working longer hours, funny enough, weren't the unhappy ones necessarily. So have you found in your sort of data and research that the length of time or the hours people work have been a factor that affects their happiness?
I think the nearest thing that we've seen that is its factor of difficulty and challenge. So what I mean by that is people who find their job too easy become unhappy. People who find their job too difficult start to experience things like burnout or stress and fatigue. So what we find in our exit data, because the happiness index measures data from onboarding all the way through to exit on the employee experience. But what we see in the exit data is one of the main reasons people leave is where that difficulty is out of sync, too hard or too difficult. And the people to learn from in that area, people like Nintendo, people like Sega, all the master computer games developers, because the computer games are developed so that when you start, there's lots of helpful tips, there's lots of advice, they're slightly easier, and as you progress, it gets more difficult. But the difficulty levels at which it increases is set so that you don't find it too hard or too easy. So I think it's really important that you look at someone's employee experience from onboarding and moving up, and to get that right over time.
Absolutely. And I think one of the other key factors that is interesting in the last year is the blame game.
Yeah.
So obviously we work with technology marketing people, and quite often quite leadership team who are paid substantially awful lot of money, and they're quite happy with the money they're paid, and they're happy with all their hygiene factors. But in the last year, because things aren't going right, there's been like a blame in the company. So is it sales fault? Is it products fault? Is it marketing's fault? And rather than work together as a team, like the leaders have kind of like been blaming, or there's had to be a blame for somebody. And you think this is obviously a long-term common denominator and stuff to do with personality types. If you're in a company like that now, is there any advice to somebody on how you could, without just leaving the company, is there anything else they could do to perhaps shift the dial for themselves and the other leaders?
Yeah, so what you'll describe to me there, if I think of our data, I'll try and draw a virtual 4-box quadrant for everyone. If you have happy and engaged clients, happy and engaged employees, you end up in the top right, which is like thriving employees. If your employees that are unhappy and engaged, they go into survival mode. Now, I'll come to your point last, but if you have happy employees but they're not engaged, they end up unfocused. What you described, Karen, is where you have high engagement but low happiness, and lots of companies focus on engagement, but forget about happiness. So for the distinction for your listeners, from a neuroscientific perspective, we always say engagement is what your brain needs at work, and happiness is what your heart needs. Now, one's not more important than the other, but both are required. But most companies feel more comfortable talking about rational needs than emotional needs. So for me, what you described is a symptom of what we would say is a competitive culture, as opposed to a thriving culture. And the data would suggest in those organizations, they're missing out some of the drivers of happiness, like psychological safety or freedom to take opportunities. So we often see that where companies approach us and they think they've got a great culture. Now, those competitive cultures can look good on the surface till the day something goes wrong, and then everyone turns at each other and points at each other. So from what you've said, that's what my interpretation would be that. But I would recommend either the Happiness Index or one of our competitors. We've got to give them a shout, and do a deeper dive into the data, because that's my instinctive response, having looked at millions and millions of these data points. But I would say doing a cultural, what we would call a cultural assessment, to find out more.
You're deeply unhappy at the moment that you're in an organisation and you're sort of at C-suite leadership stage. Rather than think, do you know what, I'm just going to vote with my feet and leave. Maybe it's worth you're suggesting that they bring this to the table in a meeting and say, look, I noticed that things aren't going so well. There's been a lot of conflict in the company. We were doing well in the past, but why don't we do something proactive now and maybe look at something like the Happiness Index to help us identify and turn it around?
Yeah, and it's all areas of business. You need more data to be able to tell what's going on. The finance team have got their data, marketing team have got their data. So rather than trying to guess how people feel, collect the data on it. Because the higher you are up in an organization, there's a power dynamic, and you're going to get less insight from the people. So you need some kind of anonymous type survey just to really understand how people feel, so you can start to fix stuff. Otherwise, what you described could result in a downward spiral.
Yeah, okay. That's great. So if there was one thing that someone could do, one thing someone could do this week without engaging, just one tiny change in a company, that maybe if they were concerned about the happiness in their team or someone else, what's one thing they could do, just a small factor that could affect or make a difference, do you think?
I would ask all managers, just in their next one-on-one, just to ask the person they're having a one-on-one with, just to ask them what makes them happy. And what you'll find, and I'll ask you, I'll flip it around on you, Karen, what let me know what makes you happy, Karen.
Interesting. I was going to ask you the same question. You got there first. But what makes me happy? Making me happy is feeling like I'm going somewhere and moving forward. It could be walking outside, or it could be at the end of the day ticking something off my box when I thought at the beginning of the morning I didn't think I was going to be able to do this, and actually I've done it now and I've achieved it, and I'm feeling proud and happy because I have done it.
Yeah. So the first thing that happens anytime you ask anyone that question, they always smile. They always look up. And you did both. We can watch it back if we want to. But firstly, it puts people into a different state. It puts them into a non-transactional state where someone thinks, actually, this other person cares about me. So that's the first point. Second point, if we were a team of two, Karen, I already know what's a little bit about what's important. And I know that we need to keep progressing forward, and progression is really important to you. So I would say ask managers in their one-on-ones just to ask that question, and you'll be fascinated by what you learn.
Excellent. And I suppose it's something, once you know it once, you can't keep asking it every week, but then you could ask, like, how happy are you against your benchmark of happiness in the past? That's probably a base level, I guess.
Well, there's a cultural assessment I send out every 6 months, and it gives you the full readout of a culture. But there's a product called Employee Voice 24/7, which is how are you feeling? That's on 24/7. Companies all around the world have that switched on. It's like your family at home. You're not going to run out of the amount of times you can ask your children how they're feeling.
Yeah, exactly.
Likewise at work, starting every meeting when you're one-on-one with the people who report to you, asking them how they are is really not ever going to tire.
No, exactly. And it varies, doesn't it? Because like on Monday, you could be feeling on top of the world and fantastic. And by Wednesday, you could feel, down in the dumps and like everything's going to pot, and it's just, that's because we're humans, aren't we, with so many variables.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. So if you need a dose of happiness, what would you do?
Oh, it's a good one. I love to come to this office where we're doing the recording. I cycled in. So there's two parts of your moving forward bit that you mentioned, Karen. There is the fact that our brain is designed to work on the move. But there's also the thing that we like progression, which are two slightly different points, which you wrapped into one for us. But I've definitely learned that getting out and being active is really important. I would add into that finding your own version of meditation, because there are people out there that force feed meditation on people. And I think meditation works really well for some people in the what you imagine meditation to be. But I also think it doesn't work for everyone. And I think finding your own version of meditation, that could be cycling, that could be reading a book, that could be sitting in the woods, that could be making yourself a nice coffee and not talking to anyone, taking yourself off and being silent somewhere. So for me, I've learned what those things are, like getting out, getting on the bike. But for everyone else, I think you need to find out what your own one is.
You just summed up all the things I do, to be fair. I do all of those things. I was thinking, I read, I listen. Sometimes I think I do too many different things, but I ask myself personally, what do I need? What do I need right now? Do I need silence? Do I need something? Do I need to just burn it out? Do I need to think it out? What do I need to do? And that I can't do the formal meditation, but that's what I do, actually. It's like a different versions of myself. But yeah, interesting. Great. So anything else that I should have asked you today that I haven't asked you that you'd like to tell our listeners?
That's a really good question. I think for me, it's about what are the barriers to potentially this? What is the barriers in what are the normal barriers in an organization? And I'll take you through the top two. The top two barriers organizationally are, firstly, people fear what they're going to find out from a survey. They worry. I'm just talking to the what I hear behind the scenes all the time. So someone might listen to this and they go, "Oh wow, brilliant! I'm going to take employee happiness seriously." But they go and speak to the CEO, and they think, "Oh, this is a great idea, but we already know there's loads of skeletons in the cupboard, and we don't want to open up to that." So the first point on that is, your employees already know what's going on in the organization because they are the employees that have their feelings and thoughts. So the first thing is never fear what you're going to find out, because all your employees already know about it. They talk about it down the pub. They talk about it when they have a coffee. They share this stuff with each other. So they already know about it. Second bit, when you do your first data analysis, you'll find out some of these skeletons and you'll also find out some new ones. But then people fear, if we tell everyone about all the bad stuff, it'll make them unhappy. The people who gave you this information, told you how they feel, already know about it again. So not telling them back to them what they told you is barrier number 2. So they're funny things and they sound so simple, but it happens all the time. Like, don't fear what you might find out. Every single company in the world has unhappy employees. There's no perfect family out there that doesn't have any issues. There's no perfect company. So don't fear what you're going to find out. And then when you do find it out, because you will find out issues, and there's no company in the world that we've ever worked with that doesn't have issues. When you do find it out, everyone's brain goes to, oh, maybe we should water that down. Maybe we shouldn't say it, because if we say it out loud, it'll make everything worse. What will make it worse is ignoring it and then not acknowledging it. So then you're faced with 2 options once you have your information: do something with it, or do something or not do something. And I'll let our listeners decide, Karen, what they should do out of those 2 options.
Absolutely. Yeah, I do you know what? It's so true, because I remember at the beginning of my career being afraid of feedback, almost not wanting to ask for feedback. But just because I felt that if I asked for feedback, it made me vulnerable, and it would also make me feel like I wasn't in control and I didn't already know it. But I think that's one thing I've learned as I've grown and developed my business and worked with so many people, that people love giving feedback. They love hearing feedback, and being heard is the most important thing really in a company, and not just trying to bury it. So yeah, absolutely, really well summarised. So thank you for including that.
So Karen, just to give you one last data point. So earlier I mentioned one of the top 4 drivers of is acknowledgement, okay? But if we go into acknowledgement and we look at the drivers of acknowledgement, there's 3 drivers of acknowledgement: recognition, listening to, and feedback. Us as human beings, we are looking at feedback all the time. We're just uncomfortable with it. So the more you do it, the more you get used to it. Like, even though it happens all the time at the Happiness Index, and I encourage people to give me feedback, I still feel uncomfortable sometimes. But if you go back to when you're little, when you're growing and you get those growing pains in your leg, that's what feedback's like. It never stops being uncomfortable, because sometimes it's stuff that you don't want to recognize in yourself. But if you just look at it as an opportunity to grow, you won't look back.
No, absolutely. And being uncomfortable is something we've all tried to avoid, but ultimately that leads us to happiness, doesn't it? Because if we can be uncomfortable and we can overcome what's making us feel uncomfortable, it's like a problem solved, but it's kind of an irrational brain thing. Great stuff. Oh, well, thank you so much. It's really been brilliant. The time's gone so quickly, and I've absolutely loved learning more about the Happiness Index and your insights. It's been an absolute wonderful experience talking to you. Thank you so much. Anything else you want to mention at this stage before we say goodbye?
No, I would just say don't take it all too seriously. You can go to thehappinessindex.com and book a demo, right? But also you can do all the stuff that we started with. Just start the conversation. And don't take it too seriously.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Matt. It's been a pleasure meeting you today, and hopefully we'll have a chance to speak again in the future.